bedtime is rough. Even for Peanut. That's why people will try anything to fall asleep. Headstands before bed, even blowing bubbles. But Ashley has a trick that works every time. A new Tempur-Pedic mattress. It adapts to your body's needs to help you fall asleep faster and stay asleep longer. You'll wake up feeling refreshed every day. Even Peanut agrees. So ditch the wacky bedtime rituals. Head to Ashley to take home a Tempur-Pedic today.
This episode is brought to you by Nordstrom. Reemerge in style this spring with Nordstrom. It's a time to express yourself through your personal style. And Nordstrom's complimentary styling services will help you build the ultimate spring wardrobe. With inspirational products from the best brands covering this season's trends, Nordstrom is the one-stop destination for new spring fashion and all your wardrobing needs. Visit your nearest store or on the Nordstrom app or online anytime.
At Atlassian, we believe impossible things are only impossible alone. Just ask the 75% of Fortune 500 companies that use Atlassian products like Jira, Confluence, and Trello to tackle their biggest challenges. Atlassian, for projects impossible alone.
Welcome to the New Books Network.
Welcome to New Books in History, a channel on the New Books Network. I'm your host, Michael Vann of Sacramento State University, but please call me Mike. Today, I'm speaking with Daniel Bessner and Matt Christman about their new podcast miniseries, Hinge Points. Yeah, don't tell Marshall, but I'm taking a few liberties here and doing a podcast about podcasts, like a coffee table book about coffee tables, something like that. And I want to do this because Hinge Points is about some major what-ifs in world history. Matt Christman is best known for his work on Chapo Trap House, a political humor and cultural commentary podcast. He also posts almost daily vlogs where he reflects on history. And he has co-authored the Chapo Guide to Revolution with his fellow Chapo Trap House hosts. Daniel Bessner, an intellectual historian of U.S. foreign relations, is the author of Democracy in Exile, Hans Speyer, not Hans Speer, right? Hans Speyer.
Hans Speyer, yeah.
Hans Speyer, and the rise of the defense intellectual with Cornell in 2018, and was co-editor with Nicolas Guillot of The Decisionist Imagination: Sovereignty, Social Science, and Democracy in the 20th Century with Bergen in 2019. He holds the Geoff Hanauer Honors Professorship in Western Civilization. Boy, that's a Western Civilization name right there.
Yeah, it's a hell of a named professorship, I have to say. Yeah.
At the University of Washington, he's also a non-resident fellow at the Quincy Institute for Responsible Statecraft and a contributing editor at Jacobin. In 2019-2020, he also served as a foreign policy advisor to the Bernie Sanders presidential campaign. In addition to all of his scholarly work, he's published in the New York Times, the Washington Post, the Guardian, and other venues. Daniel Bessner also hosts the American Prestige podcast with David Davison, which I strongly recommend, in addition to Chapo.
Derek Davison. I jokingly call him David Davison a lot, but it's Derek.
Davidson.
It's Derek.
I apologize.
It's okay.
Well, okay. Let me see if I get this one right. Daniel Bessner and Matt Christman, welcome to Chapo. Oh my God! Welcome to New Books in History. Oh boy, fanboy fail hard. Oh God, full Chris Farley moment right there for me. Okay, welcome to New Books in History.
Thanks for having us, man.
Thanks for having us.
Yeah, and by the way, Matt is the returning champion. Got to talk to him about the Chapo Guide to Revolution. I don't know, about a year ago or so. Mm-hmm. And that was a fun conversation. It's in the archive, listeners. Look it up. Before we talk about the podcast miniseries Hinge Points, tell us a little bit about yourselves, how you came to host a history podcast. Daniel, you go first.
Sure.
Danny, you go first.
Yeah. Well, no problem. I mean, first off, I'm a historian. And, for a long time, I'd been listening to Chapo, and I'd been just really impressed with Matt's thinking. In particular, the way that he, and I'm not just like blowing smoke. I think it's interesting because it says something about the modern historical profession. Matt does a type of like big brain thinking, big macro thinking that is just not allowed in a historical profession that is increasingly specialized, that increasingly increasingly forces one to, like, the division of labor, as Marx said, everything becomes increasingly specialized, and so you're focused on ever narrow topics. But I'm someone who studies pre-war intellectual history and World War II, and just immediate post-war history, and there used to be a space for this type of thinking. So I've always been attracted to that type of, like, very big Alfred Thayer Mahan type thinking, in some sense, even an Oswald Spenglerian type approach. Spengler had his problems, don't get me wrong, but this sort of big thinking.
Alfred
And I
Baron
think,
too.
yeah. And I think that Matt is really one of the most interesting historical minds doing historical work today that you can't really do in the academy. And so I was always attracted to that. And then he and I just became friends, and we started having these, I think, fun conversations. And just it emerged very organically from that, from just having conversations about, big historical questions, counterfactual reasoning, big what ifs. I think Matt and I were both Harry Turtledove fans as kids. And so this is something that we've been thinking about for years. And I think it really just developed from there.
Wait, well, actually, Matt, I got a follow up for Danny. So you have a day job, as a professor. How do you balance your more academic work with your more, I don't know, public facing scholarship or more popular work? And I don't know. How do you feel that's valued in the academy or
Sure.
not?
Well, I think my department is unique. I'm not in a history department, and I think that's crucial. I don't think the type of work that I do, which is relatively methodologically traditional intellectual history, which is not especially popular, combined with another unpopular field, diplomatic history, slash, the history of military thought, which is really what I do, the intellectual history of diplomatic and military thinking, is not exactly a hot topic in history departments right now, which is, fine. Things go up and down, whatever. So first of all, I'm not in a history department. And so I'm in a Department of International Studies that really values that sort of public engagement. So that's been my first and only academic job. And from the beginning, they really encourage that sort of work, that sort of public-facing work. It's also something that I've always wanted to do. I mean, I grew up reading the New York Review of Books, the New York Times Book Review, so I was always interested in that sort of more popular thinking that you could get at in an essay. And I also do think that this is something we as a profession haven't fully addressed, which is that reading habits have fundamentally changed. People just read fewer books. And you really see that in the decline of the novel. Look at 1985 readership numbers compared to 2021, it's precipitous. And we as a profession haven't addressed that at all. And I do think, that certain types of communication flourish in particular moments. And I do think that right now we are in the era of the essay and the era of the podcast. So as someone who never was interested in writing only for a small cohort of scholars, and this has become even more true given that the history profession is essentially dying. I don't think we're going to see future generations of historians in a genuine way unless there's a radical exogenous change. I became less and less interested in only writing for the academy, even though I still do that because the genre of academic writing, it does allow for a form of long-term thinking unavailable elsewhere. But I was always interested in speaking to the public, and so I basically gravitated relatively naturally toward the two forms of public engagement that are dominant today. Again, the essay and the podcast.
Yeah, well, I would add to that. I think there's a trifecta. This is also the age of the graphic history, where
Yes,
the graphic
agreed.
format. I'm waving my book at the screen right now, where the graphic format actually is being taken seriously and is being explored as a way to communicate some really sophisticated ideas to a wider audience without necessarily pandering down. But yeah, I appreciate that. Hey, Matt, I'm sorry I interrupted you earlier. Give us some origin story. Where did Matt Christman, history podcaster, come from?
I mean, it started with me, reading all of the Time Life Civil War books, and I was like 12. But more approximately, it was meeting Danny and becoming friends and realizing that we had similar interests in like thinking about history in terms of its like broader contours, and a similar conviction that we're living like sort of in the corpse of a human social concept that that is still sort of operates off of a zombie logic but has lost its anima. and that looking backward and finding contingent moments is not just fun Harry Turtledove stuff, which we both loved, but also I think a critical component of performing like essentially an autopsy on a certain like vision for human flourishing that is now just accumulating fatal contradictions at a geological rate. So we decided to put some stuff down, and it came very easily, and I think it's some pretty interesting conversations.
Yeah, I mean, how do you see your role as I don't know, a, do I want to say popularizer or communicator of, some high level historical and theoretical, very heavily influenced by Marxist theory, but some high level discourses to an audience that may not, wouldn't have picked up the American Historical Review or picked up a monograph or picked up maybe even a more popular history textbook. I mean, you have a certain charisma. You're good on a microphone. You got a fun way of explaining stuff. It's thoughtful and engaging. I mean, how do you see that role? I mean, I don't know what to call it. Public intellectual. How do you? I don't know what I'm asking. How do you conceive of yourself and what you're doing with these kinds of history podcasts?
Well, I'm obviously like unlike Danny and yourself, I am not credentialed in any kind of historical discipline. I am really just a guy. So what I bring to the conversation really is an understanding, hopefully, that this is not the same thing as like academic history. This is not the same. I mean, the word discipline, for example, is apt because there isn't any in what I do. But what I hope fills that gap is, as Danny said, a willingness to go to sort of stratospheres of analysis that historians at this point are basically disallowed from doing. And also, yes, making it more conventionally entertaining and also more easily digestible because of the podcast format than history usually is. But yeah. I do hope that I'm able to communicate enough personal earnestness, I guess, to make people, at least if they don't like necessarily take what I'm saying for granted, as they shouldn't, they at least accept that I'm genuinely trying to, more than anything, figure something out for myself that they can, come along and hopefully follow my train of thinking. And talking to Danny and having like a dialogue allows a lot of ideas for both of us to sort of spring up, and hopefully people can follow both of us towards conclusions that make them think about history in a new way. That's the hope.
Yeah, no, I think that's definitely part of your sort of podcast persona charisma. This like really sincere communication of like trying to struggle through making meaning of the present and how the past created this present, and bringing the audience into that, and in a really honest and genuine way. I mean, it doesn't feel contrived or anything like that, but it's like this. And I always think it's really really lovely the way that you're able to make some pretty high concept pieces from Marxist theory accessible and applicable, and like, oh, well, that's how that plays out. So could you guys tell us about the premise of Hinge Points? Maybe that's given away in the title. It's billed as a what if discussion, but I think it's much more than just sort of what if or counterfactual history, because you really get into the historical context. I'm real curious about how you guys sort of balance contingency with an appreciation of larger structures. You're both well versed in Marxist theory. I mean, that will lead you away from the great man in history, but the whole notion of a hinge point, shades towards that great man in history making the decision. So, how do you balance these two? Danny, please.
Sure. So I think the first thing we do is we just go extraordinarily deep on the hinge point that we're examining. We really play it out, provide context for the situation that we're exploring, provide the larger structural situation in which a particular issue was operating. So the thing that we have coming out today is on the German revolutions of 1918 and 1919. So we give context for those revolutions, why they occurred, what was the reason, literally the larger structural reasons why they occurred, and then we'll talk about the keel sailors and the literal historical actors who made a particular moment. So I think deep contextualization is the way we approach it at first, that we try to give a sense of the historical moment, and it's from there that we're able to identify the various interactions between structure and agency, which is the classic historical question. And I think that if there's one thing that we hope people to take from this, and that people will take from this, I think, is focusing on that problem, because Marx really emphasizes structure, and historians really emphasize agency, and bringing that perspective together. So having done that deep contextualization, then we start focusing on, the what ifs. And I think the counterfactual reasoning is actually very critical to historical reasoning, because you're ultimately telling a causal story. I think the historical method is to use narrative to make a causal claim. And there's a great historian's quote, I don't actually know where it originated, but it essentially argues that every time a historian uses the word because, they're making a causal claim, and I think that's right. So by engaging in that sort of counterfactual reasoning, we're able to highlight what we consider to be the most crucial causal factors in explaining a particular hinge point. And I think in at least this first miniseries, without planning it, 3 of our 6 episodes focus on the period between 1914 and 1920, 1921, because we really adopted a lefty approach on this one. So we're trying to explain why the left in the United States seems to be in such a ragged political condition. And so I think that's broadly the theme of the first few episodes. But the point being is highlighting the contingent elements in order to understand how we came to be, but also to try to, at least in my opinion, help contemporary people on the left think about where power lies, where agency lies, where they should direct their own energies, given what we know of the past and these crucial moments in left-wing history.
Yeah. Matt, do you have any thoughts on that balancing act?
Yeah. One thing that happened organically as we did the show and had the conversations is we would often come to a point where we recognize, well, this is an incredibly important moment where a shift occurs, and a new paradigm is going to birthed that is going to end up over determining the historical process at that point, that sometimes you can't really plausibly imagine an alternative scenario. Like that's what happened when we talked about the 1918 German revolutions. Is there are a few theoretical, blue sky things that we could imagine and changing that could have led to a different outcome, but our main conclusion was that the specific dynamics in Germany meant that it was highly unlikely that anything other than a failure to coordinate and effectively act would thwart the revolutions there. But in other cases, that's not necessarily true. But we grounded, I guess, and prevented from being sort of turtle-doveyan fancy by really taking seriously the idea of structure and the overdeterminants of structural causes, and not allowing ourselves to sort of go with a fancy. Although I think that's going to change if in future episodes we go further in the past, because I think one thing that Danny and I agree with is that in that dance between structure and contingency, the further back, the more agency and contingency can factor into decisions, and the greater the angle of departure is, if you imagine a contingent event going differently.
Is that because economic structures were simpler in pre-industrial times, and as we go further back into past, that
I think
Alexander having
it's
a Wanderlust is more important than the Athenian oil industry.
I think it's technology.
Yeah.
I think it's the degree of technological structure, the technological what's the word? The technological structure of society, I guess, just the degree of technology that stands between individuals and actions, basically. The degree to which state structures and political economies are dictated technologically. And because the more space is filled with technology, in a real sense, the less room there is for human agency.
I think that's also really important to emphasize because the history of technology is really fallen out as a professional historical field. And I think that historians today have totally lost sight of the important role that technology plays in things like human alienation, like Matt is just gesturing toward. And I think I was unique. My one of my advisors, basically my co-advisor, though not officially, was an old school historian who got his PhD in 1970 or 71 in the history of technology. So as part of my comms fields, I read a lot in the history of technology and the science and technology studies. And I think this is a problem with the historical profession as a whole, which kind of takes technology as a given. And then any time that one makes an argument about the determining role that technology plays in social life, which is so obvious in our daily lived experience to be almost unquestionable, you get accused of being an object-oriented ontologist.
Yeah.
So I think there's actually, ironically, as technology has become so dominant in our lives and the structures of capitalism have become so dominant, the historical profession has almost put them in the background, which is, ironic and problematic, and for a bunch of contingent historical reasons allowed that to happen. But I think one thing that we try to do in the show is recenter these enormous structures that professional historians oftentimes ignore.
Well, I gotta tweet at you with an angry hashtag, not all historians, because I'm working on empire and the history of pandemic disease in the late 19th and early 20th century. It's all about the technology. It's the railways. It's the steamships that create the third bubonic plague pandemic and facilitate the cholera pandemics and so forth. So some of us, not all historians, some of us are haven't lost sight of that technology and that importance.
I guess what I should say is when I say that, I mean like the elite historical departments that shape the contours of the professional historical discipline. I don't think like Harvard or Yale or Princeton has a dedicated historian of technology, which was not true 50 years ago. There would have been 2 or 3. And I think that is sort of, people are doing interesting work all the time. It's just like where that work is situated within the constellation of the quote unquote profession.
Yeah. And hiring processes are trendy and go through these phases for reasons it's difficult for us to speculate about. So the mini series topics for this season include the first one that's already out there, listen to the Social Democratic Party of Germany's decision to vote for war credits in 1914, which I thought was a really great discussion. I think you could have brought in some discussion of the French socialists and Jean Jaurès, but I got a PhD in French history, so I'll leave that one alone. The German Revolution of 1918, 1919, and that's out today.
Yes,
that's just released. Yeah. And then Reconstruction and Lincoln's assassination, importance of 9/11, and the Soviet Revolution of 1917. We don't have time to go through all of these, but I did notice that, as you pointed out, like half this miniseries is clustered around World War I. Could you talk about sort of the larger World War I, the larger Great War, and why this is, as you say, a hinge point? But by the way, thank you for that earworm of a theme song for the podcast. I was driving around yelling hinge points out of my truck from time to time. It is possibly one of the most relaxing songs I've heard recently.
That's awesome.
It's
I'm
up
glad
there
you
with
liked
Island Boys. Yeah. Anyway,
That's an important hinge point. Yeah, we should shout out our producer Jake Aaron and his band Moloch, Moloq. They also did the American Prestige theme song. If anyone wants to check his music out.
great. Yeah. So, why World War One? Why is this so significant? Why was it a hinge point?
Matt, you want to take this one, or should I?
Sure. Because I think Danny and I both agree that World War One was the apocalypse that Marx was predicting. The at least the beginning of a several decades long crisis in specifically European capitalism that was, I think, in the teleological Marx, imagined to lead to the mobilization of the European working class against the capitalist overlordship, and for a bunch of reasons that we get into in the episodes, that didn't happen. And because it didn't happen, and because the one nation state that ended up being taken over by a self-conscious working class movement in the form of the Bolsheviks was Russia, the least developed country in Europe economically, as opposed to the more advanced economies of Western Europe that Marx saw. Marx was most fixated on detailing the contours of. It shaped the next century of class war, class conflict, and the articulations of that. And we've seen the result. We've seen that now we stand sort of, as I said, in on the corpse of this movement. There might still be challenges to capitalism, but they're going to have to emerge out of a fully new terra, because the classic conception of the working class movement, the socialist movement, an international movement based on solidarity of workers, is essentially non-existent at the moment. And so we look back, and if you identify this period and World War One and the way that it concludes, sort of being the first act, really, of like a 3-act Ragnarok, but we find where we try to look for where things could have gone differently, realistically, plausibly, with a few changes of contingent outcomes, and then what that could have opened up, not necessarily made better, but possibilities that were foreclosed by the way things ended up happening.
Bedtime is rough, even for Peanut. That's why people will try anything to fall asleep. Headstands before bed, even blowing bubbles. But Ashley has a trick that works every time. A new Tempur-Pedic mattress. It adapts to your body's needs to help you fall asleep faster and stay asleep longer. You'll wake up feeling refreshed every day. Even Peanut agrees. So ditch the wacky bedtime rituals. Head to Ashley to take home a Tempur-Pedic today.
This episode is brought to you by Nordstrom. Reemerge in style this spring with Nordstrom. It's a time to express yourself through your personal style. And Nordstrom's complimentary styling services will help you build the ultimate spring wardrobe. With inspirational products from the best brands covering this season's trends, Nordstrom is the one-stop destination for new spring fashion and all your wardrobing needs. Visit your nearest store or on the Nordstrom app or online anytime.
When we work together, impossible things aren't so impossible. In fact, they become possible. That's why 75% of Fortune 500 companies work together using Atlassian software like Jira, Confluence, and Trello to tackle their biggest challenges. With a little imagination and a whole lot of collaboration, the possibilities really do become endless. Atlassian, for projects impossible alone.
Yeah, and just to put a fine point on that, at least from my perspective, we are still living in the sort of overhang of that World War I moment, where the thing that was supposed to happen didn't, and I think that there's been an essential crisis of Marxism since the failure of the working classes to maybe perhaps an overdetermined failure, as we talked about in the first episode, but the failure to unite and do what they were supposed to do. And it's interesting that people are, in response to the episode, I've noticed that people are pointing to this Engels quote, this letter from 1887, where he kind of predicts World War I. But it's interesting, they only quote the first half of that letter, and the second half is like, and this will mean the workers will win, you know? And so it's pretty, I think, interesting when we think about why didn't that happen and what that meant.
Yeah, and just to spell things out, what you're talking about is the pledge of the Second International, the organization of all the socialist parties of Europe, that they would not go to war should war come, that a coming war would be in the interests of the bankers and the industrialists and the crowned heads of Europe, not in the interest of the working class, right? They had all the socialist parties had agreed to this as and voted on it a couple of times at the Second International. And then when actually push comes to shove in the summer of 1914, as Barbara Tuchman's Guns of August start, they're on the near horizon, the socialist parties actually vote for war credits after all. Without spoiling the episode, and I don't want to do any spoilers for these episodes. I know you got one on Reconstruction, and I don't tell me what happened, because it seems like things could go really good there. But what are some of the key factors, with that failure to live up to what the socialist parties had promised, at least in terms of the German Social Democratic Party? Danny, do you want to address that?
So do you mind restating your question? What exactly are you asking?
Why didn't they live up to their promise and that they had made prior to 1914?
I think this is probably one of the biggest questions, and I think ultimately the reason is that they didn't identify more as workers than as other things. And so the question is, what are those other things, and why did they identify more as those? So the obvious answer is nationalism, and so there's a crucial element of nationalism. There's elements of racism, there's elements of regionalism, and there's elements of communalism. They identify more with their community than they do as workers. But the way that I think about it is that Marx said, I mean, the whole thing is premised on, when he's talking about subjective conditions, the proletariat becoming conscious of itself as the subject-object of history, as Lukács put it in Geschichte und Klassenbewusstsein, which I believe was written in 1919 or 21, I think it's 21. But anyway, so like that didn't happen. So it's a question of consciousness also. And this is why I think you see the turn towards culture after the World War I, right? The Frankfurt School gets going in the 1920s as essentially incorporating a critique of culture and psychoanalysis, a critique of mind, into the traditional Marxist material analysis. So I think that's why, right? And then there's a million possible answers as to why working class identity didn't become the foundational political identity that one could explore. And then there's also just the fact that there was, as Matt will no doubt speak to, there were a lot of interest groups militating against that sort of identity formation. It's a very difficult thing to do. It's a very difficult thing to do across borders when you're speaking different languages in the absence of like regular communications and lived experiences. So I think that's essentially the major reason why it didn't happen, at least from my perspective. Yeah.
And there's also a level, and you touched on this in the podcast, of the institutionalization, at least of the German Social Democratic Party, which I think stands in sharp contrast to the French socialists, who are much more fractured, much less bureaucratic. I scolded you guys a second ago, but I think a really good discussion would be, what if Jean Jaurès had not been assassinated in the streets of Paris in the summer of 1914? Because he seems, definitely in France, and then possibly Europe-wide, could have that.
So my take on that, yeah, I'm also European. I mean, my major field is modern European. I just don't think France had the industrial structure of a Germany, and that's a really big difference when you're talking about working class revolution. I mean, Germany is really the industrial heartland in a way that France, from my understanding, there's still a lot of artisans, there's still a lot of small craft workshops. It's not as much of an industrialized base.
Yeah, and the socialist movement in France was a hot mess. I mean,
And very
it was
different,
so factualized. I mean,
kind of Marxist, not
yeah,
Marxist, yeah.
but in such contrast to Germany, but could also, in that crazy wild ferment, actually produce a really charismatic figure like Jean Jaurès.
And that's why, like, a Sorel is French, he's dealing with different that's why anarcho-syndicalism is not a German thing. Germany, there's actually enough of an industrial base to have the classic Marxist thing going on, and I think France is appreciably different. So I don't think that would have been enough for like the contours, the future of world socialism. Though it is an interesting what if the German and French working classes had united. But that's my take on that one.
Yeah. Matt, what are your key sort of talking points on the failure of the Second International?
I think that institutionalization of the party is a very significant feature, because to be effective, a working class movement of any kind has to have some sort of structure of leadership to effectively distribute, resources and to coordinate action. But the paradox of building working class institutional power is that once you have institutions staffed by people, those people no longer live working class lives. They no longer have the subjective experience of being a worker that the masses of the party have. They live effectively bourgeois existences, and that changes. I would argue that fundamentally changes the decision matrix and the motivational framework of someone within a structure like that, because they no longer only have their chains to lose. They have their nice office job and a life that is, according to every social reality that they encounter every day, that is convivial and relatively pleasant. And a communist future would fundamentally threaten and replace them with something that they would be unfamiliar with and maybe not be in charge of, and very well could be in some real felt sense a reduction of circumstances.
Yeah. So you guys got a whole hour on this. Encourage listeners to check it out, obviously. But you, as I said, you've got 3 podcasts centering around First World War I issues, the sort of dawn of the 20th century, making of the contemporary world. But you also go into American history. You've got an episode on Reconstruction. What are some of the big themes you engage in there? And again, no spoilers, because I was trained as a Europeanist and a Southeast Asianist. I don't know anything about American history, but I was good in the early 1870s.
I was first and foremost a Civil War nerd as a child. That's what got me into history, and so the Civil War in general has been a long-standing fixation on me. Not alone in that; it's very common among American history dorks. So my understanding of the Civil War as an incredibly important crucible for creating our modern American state has always been very keen. But over time, I've, as many people have, noticed how deeply our embedded contradictions and specifically the things that have retarded our development of socialist politics, development of working class consciousness, are really the product of the failed Reconstruction process after the Civil War. Not just in I would argue, not just in restructuring Southern society, but in restructuring our governing institutions. There's no reason, there is no, you cannot make an argument based on like rationality why the Constitution should have survived the end of the Civil War. The constitutional order was designed to prevent specifically the kind of catastrophic breakup that the Civil War embodied. And over the course of the war, one thing that was revealed is that if you lack institutional buy-in to these hallowed notions of separation of power, there's no force backing them, and that if you are going to replace a slave economy with a fulfilled popular democracy, then its institutions need to reflect that. But that didn't happen for a number of reasons. And one of the most intriguing things about Reconstruction, from my perspective, as opposed to the question of the German Revolution, is that I think you really can imagine not a completely different outcome, not we have full communism if this doesn't happen, but you can imagine a different United States that responds to world historical actions differently if you do not have at the very crucial transition point from war to Reconstruction, Abraham Lincoln replaced by Andrew Johnson. And so we go through just exactly how specifically and personally responsible Johnson is for some of the worst failures of Reconstruction, which I think is significant. And then imagine what a different constellation of forces at the top of the government at a moment when the United States government is able to assert power that had previously been impossible to conceive of it doing, and what that would have meant for the future of the country, the alternative future of the country.
Yeah, but even with Johnson, as and then after he's gone, I mean, the 1870s seems like there's going to be a sea change in the United States. You have African Americans voting, you have a huge number in state and winning state and national elections, and then comes 1877, right? I mean, then that comes down, but that 6-7 year period of in hindsight, tremendous optimism, like things are being reconstructed. Mm-hmm. And then so here's my full confession. I had zero interest in American history as an undergraduate and graduate school because I was a victim of the bad American history class in high school. Right, it seems so boring to me, and it wasn't until a couple of years ago when I was teaching summer school in Shanghai that I got assigned a U.S. history class that I had to read up on this stuff, and I never really understood until I probably shouldn't admit this just a few years ago how significantly different the country could have gone in terms of its trajectory, in terms of who's in political office in the 1870s and what that could have developed organically. I mean, those numbers aren't replicated again until the 1970s.
Yeah. And there was a Civil Rights Act.
I was about to mention that. Yeah,
passed. In watered down form and then struck down by the Supreme Court in this period that was essentially the civil rights movement of the 1960s in its particulars. Like that was a live political agenda with an actual constituency that was competing for power at the time. And I do think that with different headwinds from the top, that those contours change.
Well, I don't know. I'm just amateur here, but to me, you know what this sounds like? A hinge point.
Indeed. It absolutely is. And also, I just as a French historian, I mean, how unique it is that the United States is still living off its constitution from the late 18th century. We're on like the fifth French Republic.
The Fifth Republic. And, and a couple of empires and a quasi-fascist regime thrown in the mix.
Yeah, so it's the US is weird in that it's exceptional in that regard.
Well, it was given to us by Jesus.
God, by Jesus himself. Yeah,
down that incredible Republican painting. I got to be cognizant of time here. I'd love to chat with you guys forever. But quickly, you're going to do an episode on 9/11. Is this history yet? Can we actually do this history? Is this Is this journalism? Is this history?
Well, I think the way we approach 9/11 is it's not what you expect, because it focuses a lot on culture, actually, in media.
Oh, cool. Yeah.
And how 9/11 was this hinge point for how we, as a populace, experienced an event. So I think that episode is pretty cool, because we don't just do the like normal, what one might expect from an alternate 9/11 history, but we really examine how it's a hinge point in sort of the subjective experience of politics, which I think Matt and I agree is really a lot of people's only experience with politics today. Right. The simulacrum of political experience. And so we really focus on that angle in the 9/11 episode, and I think people will find that pretty interesting, I hope.
Okay, well, that sounds fabulous. Are you guys going to do a second season? Are there going to be? Are there more hinge points out there?
I think we're. I mean, we have enough ideas. We and things we'd like to talk about that I think we likely will. Yeah, I would like to do a whole Napoleon episode, just
or
like different.
Yeah, we were
different
thinking
places
of doing a couple,
that little corporal could have thrown the ways he could have thrown the dice and make things differently. But also, I'd like to get deeper past, and where it's like I think be more whimsical, really, because at that point, you can really throw anything at the board, as I said, because everything feels a lot more, even if it feels more malleable.
Yeah, I think like we'd like to do some Roman history ones, some medieval ones. We'd like to expand beyond the North Atlantic. So I think it depends if people like the show and we get a good response. We're certainly able to do more, and hopefully we will.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I don't know how up you guys are on Chinese history, but Zheng He, the great admiral of the Ming Dynasty, what if
treasure fleet,
his fleet had not been scuttled? I mean, Good Lord, what would da Gama have done sailing into the Indian Ocean had one of Zheng He's 440-foot treasure ships just appeared and blown them out of the water? I mean, it was just such a radical rethinking. So you guys have been really generous with your time, and I've got two more questions for both of you. First, can you suggest two books, or seeing how we've gone a little Colonel Kurtz here and gone up the river, maybe two podcasts, that you would suggest to the listeners? Danny?
So for books, I think the classic one on the German revolutions is Eberhard Kolb's book, which is a really excellent book. I mean, it's written in a bit of an old style, but I think it's quite good, and people might not be familiar with it. And also, I think is it the Karl Schorsky book, The Great Schism? That's actually a really readable. Yes, Karl Schorsky, German Social Democracy, 1905 to 1917, the development of the Great Schism. It's also an old one, but it's really readable, and I really point people towards those two if they want to get a better sense of the first two episodes.
Great. Is there one history podcast that you'd really recommend, aside from Hinge Points, of course, and aside from new books?
Let's give that to Matt. My history content is mostly in my professional life.
Yeah, exactly. He's the credentialed one. He does the reading. I just do the listening because I don't have class in the morning.
You don't have a stack of papers you have to grade.
Exactly. Yeah, I'm a big fan of Mike Duncan's Revolutions.
Yeah,
I do. I think that's a great narrative history. Like, there's not necessarily a ton of interpretive stuff, but I feel like if you are someone who doesn't know what happened about stuff, like the details,
did you have him on?
Feels like it might. Yeah, we had him on.
We had him on Chapo, that was a good convo. A couple years ago, right?
Yeah. It was a good convo, but I feel like he's a good source for a narrative of like crucial historical hinge points that gives you, at the very least, a very good sense of the players and the forces arrayed, which is, I think, very useful. And I think Patrick Wyman's stuff is very good too. The Tides of History. That's a good podcast.
Tides of History. Yep. Yeah. I've been loving your former colleagues' work with. Of course, I'm drawing a blank now. They did the Blowback.
Oh yes, Blowback.
Blowback is great.
The second season has been phenomenal.
on Cuba, right? Second season's on Cuba. First season was on the Iraq War.
Yeah.
I thought that was like just fantastic. Well researched, but very, very accessible. I love their blend of humor and some cheekiness with some really serious content.
Yeah, they're really good journalists. I think like
Yeah.
that is just that podcast in particular, both Noah and Brendan, just really shows what journalists could bring that professional historians can't. You know,
Yeah.
a sense of storytelling, a sense of excitement and adventure, and I can't wait to see what they do next.
Yeah. Matt, what are you working on now? What can we hope to see from you next?
My Pet Chapo editor, Chris Wade, and I just finished a Stitcher podcast called Hell of Presidents about American presidential history. And we're in the early stages. It'll probably not come out till next year. Probably maybe the summer of next year. For doing a 30 Years War podcast that's going to be about sort of history or about Europe, the forces sort of vying for power in early modern Europe, and how the ground of those conflicts sowed the rise of capitalism, specifically English capitalism. So that's going to be the next thing.
Cool.
No, it's an interesting hinge point, Matt. Like the Armada wins. And
I'm
it's
honestly,
the
yes.
Spanish form of
I was
capitalism
thinking we could
takes
do that
over.
one.
Yeah,
Because
that would be a fun one.
There was a lot of ships, folks.
There were a lot of ships.
Danny, what are you working on?
I've got a couple of academic things coming out on the Rand Corporation.
Cool.
I've got a essay collection that'll probably come out soon. I'm co-editing a volume on Cold War liberalism. I'm co-editing a volume on the domestic history of U.S. foreign policy. And then I'm going to start serious work on my theoretically next academic book, an imperial history of Los Angeles. So all those things coming.
That's fantastic.
Yeah, I think it'll be fun.
For years, I've been saying someone should do a similar project for San Francisco because so much of the Pacific Empire is run out of San Francisco and place names just from the American occupation of the Philippines.
Yep.
There's so many streets named after generals and whatnot.
Yeah, no, I think they're totally related. And then if that works, then I might do a bigger California thing because I really do think much more. I'm from New York. I do think, having lived on the West Coast for a while, that it is much more the embodiment of the present American empire than New York City and any of the East Coast cities. So I want to explore that in a bit of a more serious fashion.
Oh, that's fantastic. That sounds like a great project. I'm from Honolulu, so I get that.
Yeah.
And
you and Barack Obama.
yeah, I used to run into him when I was a kid. He was a little older than me. He served me ice cream in Baskin Robbins when I was in elementary school. He was in high school.
If you like your chocolate jimmies, you can keep them.
and I think we used to steal cigarettes while he was playing basketball out of his thing, and we would use them as fuses to set off firecrackers from his thing.
Secretary of partying down. Nice.
Public consumption. My students know all about this. But he went to my rival high school. He went to Punahou.
Oh God.
Whereas
horrible.
Sun Yat-sen went to my high school.
Oh, nice.
We got a real guy. Hey, Matt and Danny, thank you so much for chatting with me. I really appreciate it.
Thanks
for having
Mike.
us.
Love to come back.
Yeah. So this has been a conversation with Matt Christman of Chapo Trap House and Daniel Bessner of the University of Washington about their new podcast miniseries, Hinge Points. Hey, quickly, where can people find Hinge Points?
It is on
your podcast.
The Chapo Trap House Patreon page. Yeah, it's no extra charge if you're subscribing to the bonus episodes. It's in there. But if you just want to listen to it, you can also get bonus Chapo episodes.
Okay, great. Sorry, I got to plug these things. So I'm Michael Vann of Sacramento State University. This has been an episode of New Books in History. Got it right this time. A channel on the New Books Network. Thank you for listening.